Welcome, dear listener. Take a moment now to settle into a comfortable position. Let your body relax. Let your shoulders drop. Allow your breathing to become slow and steady. Tonight, we are going to take a quiet journey together. A journey that will carry you gently across the centuries, back through the mists of time, to a world that existed long before our own. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the sounds of your modern world fade away. Imagine that you are drifting softly and peacefully through the corridors of history. We are traveling back nearly 2,000 years to a time when the great Roman Empire stretched across the known world. We are going to visit a place called Rome, not the Rome of emperors and gladiators that you may have seen in movies, but a quieter Rome, a simpler Rome, the Rome of ordinary people. Tonight we will walk through narrow streets and dusty pathways. We will smell the smoke of small cooking fires and the warm scent of freshly baked bread. We will hear the gentle murmur of voices in the early morning and the soft clatter of wooden bowls. We will discover how everyday Romans, the shopkeepers, the laborers, the mothers, the children, prepared their food, shared their meals, and found small moments of comfort in the simple act of eating. This is not a story of grand banquets or elaborate feasts. This is a story of bread and olives, of porridge and wine mixed with water, of street vendors calling out their wares in the golden afternoon light. This is a story of daily life, told gently and slowly, so that you may relax and let your mind wander through the ancient streets of Rome. So settle in, dear listener. Let your thoughts become quiet. Let your body become heavy and warm, and let us begin our journey together, step by step, breath by breath, into the gentle heart of ancient Rome. Let us begin by painting a picture of this ancient world. The time is somewhere around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, a period when the Roman Empire was at its height, stretching from the misty shores of Britain in the north to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt in the south, from the forests of Germania in the east to the rocky coasts of Hispania in the west. At the center of this vast empire lay the city of Rome itself. Imagine a city built upon 7 gentle hills, nestled along the winding banks of the Tiber River. The sky above is often a soft, hazy blue, warmed by the Mediterranean sun. In the mornings, a gentle mist sometimes rises from the river, drifting through the lower streets before the sun burns it away. Rome in this era was home to perhaps 1 million people, an enormous number for the ancient world. It was a city of towering apartment buildings called insulae, some rising 5 or 6 stories high. It was a city of narrow, winding streets that twisted and turned like the paths of a labyrinth. It was a city of temples and fountains, of markets and workshops, of small gardens hidden behind crumbling walls. But most of all, it was a city of people, ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. Bakers rising before dawn to light their ovens, mothers carrying water from public fountains, children playing in dusty courtyards, old men sitting in the shade, watching the world go by. These were the true citizens of Rome, not the senators and generals whose names fill the history books, but the countless unnamed souls who lived and worked and ate and slept within the ancient city's walls. The streets of Rome were never truly quiet.
Even in the early morning, before the sun had fully risen, you could hear the sounds of the city coming to life. The creak of wooden cartwheels, the braying of donkeys, the voices of vendors setting up their stalls, the clatter of shutters being thrown open, the soft padding of sandaled feet on stone. The air carried many scents. Some were pleasant: the warm fragrance of bread baking in clay ovens, the earthy smell of fresh vegetables piled in market stalls, the faint sweetness of ripe figs drying in the sun. Others were less pleasant: the sharp tang of animal dung, the musty odor of crowded tenements, the smoky haze that hung over certain neighborhoods where metalworkers and potters plied their trades. The light in Rome had a particular quality. In the mornings it was soft and golden, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. At midday it became bright and harsh, driving people indoors or into colonnades or awnings. In the late afternoon it mellowed again, turning warm and amber, painting the walls of buildings in shades of honey and rose. And in the evening, as the sun sank below the western hills, the light faded to purple and gray, and the city prepared itself for the quiet hours of night. This was the Rome of ordinary days, not the Rome of triumphal parades and bloody spectacles, but the Rome of morning errands and afternoon naps, of simple meals and quiet conversations. This was the Rome we are going to explore tonight, one gentle step at a time. To understand how ordinary Romans ate, we must first understand where they lived. The city of Rome was divided into many neighborhoods, each with its own character and atmosphere. Some neighborhoods were home to the wealthy, elegant townhouses with interior gardens, mosaic floors, and private kitchens. But most Romans lived in far humbler circumstances. The majority of Rome's population lived in apartment buildings called insulae. These were tall, crowded structures, often poorly built and prone to collapse or fire. The ground floors might contain shops or taverns, while the upper floors were divided into small apartments, some consisting of only one room. Imagine climbing a narrow, worn staircase in one of these buildings. The steps are steep and uneven. The walls on either side are close, sometimes darkened by smoke or stained by years of use. As you rise higher, the apartments become smaller and more cramped. The poorest families lived at the very top, in tiny rooms beneath the roof, where the air was stifling in summer and cold in winter. In these small apartments, there was little space for furniture, perhaps a simple bed, a wooden chest for belongings, a few clay pots for storage, and crucially, there was almost never a kitchen. Cooking with open flames in these wooden, crowded buildings was extremely dangerous. Fires could spread rapidly through an insula, destroying entire blocks of the city. For this reason, most ordinary Romans did not cook their own meals at home.
This single fact shaped the entire culture of food in ancient Rome. Without kitchens, ordinary people had to find other ways to eat. They bought prepared food from street vendors. They ate at small taverns and cookshops. They consumed simple, cold meals that required no cooking: bread, olives, cheese, dried fruits, nuts. The rhythm of eating in ancient Rome was fundamentally different from what we know today. Let us now explore this world more deeply. Let us walk through the streets where food was sold, peek into the small establishments where meals were served, and discover what ordinary Romans actually ate from day to day. The Roman day began early. Most people rose with the sun, or even before it. In the dim light of early morning, while the stars were still fading from the sky, the city began to stir. Imagine waking in a small apartment high above the street. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. Through a small window, perhaps just an opening in the wall covered with a wooden shutter, you can see the first pale light of dawn creeping across the rooftops. There is no elaborate morning routine. You rise from your simple bed, perhaps just a mattress stuffed with straw or wool laid upon a wooden frame. You splash a little water on your face from a clay basin. You pull on your tunic, a simple garment of wool or linen that serves as the basic clothing for most Romans. And then, almost immediately, your thoughts turn to food. For most ordinary Romans, the first meal of the day was called the ientaculum. It was a simple affair, nothing like the elaborate breakfasts we might imagine today. There was no cooking involved, no hot food fresh from the stove. Instead, the ientaculum consisted of whatever simple foods were available. A piece of bread left over from the previous day, perhaps dipped in wine or olive oil to soften it. A handful of olives, a few dried figs or dates, perhaps a small piece of cheese. This meal was eaten quickly, often standing up or while walking to the first tasks of the day. There was no lingering over breakfast, no leisurely conversation over steaming cups of coffee. The ientaculum was purely functional, a way to quiet the stomach and provide enough energy to begin the morning's work. The bread that formed the centerpiece of this meal deserves special attention. Bread was the most important food in ancient Rome. It was the foundation of the Roman diet, consumed at every meal by people of every social class. The quality of the bread varied enormously, from coarse, dark loaves made of roughly ground grain to fine white bread made of carefully sifted flour. But bread itself was universal. Most ordinary Romans did not bake their own bread. Instead, they purchased it from professional bakers whose shops could be found throughout the city. These bakeries, called pistrina, were busy places, filled with the warmth of large clay ovens and the sweet, yeasty smell of rising dough. Imagine passing by one of these bakeries in the early morning. Through the open doorway, you can see the glow of the oven fire. You can hear the soft thump of dough being kneaded on wooden tables. You can smell the intoxicating aroma of bread just coming out of the oven, golden crusted, steaming slightly in the cool morning air. The baker and his workers have been awake for hours, preparing the day's bread. Some bakeries used donkeys or mules to turn the heavy millstones that ground grain into flour. You might hear the slow, patient footsteps of these animals, walking in endless circles in a back room, their hooves worn smooth by years of labor. The bread itself came in many shapes and sizes. Some loaves were round, scored with deep lines that divided them into wedges for easy breaking. Others were long and narrow, or braided, or stamped with the mark of the baker who made them. Some breads were plain, others were flavored with herbs, cheese, or honey. For the poorest Romans, bread was sometimes the only food they would eat all day. For others, it was the constant companion to every other food, used to scoop up sauces, to wrap around pieces of meat or fish, to soak up the last drops of olive oil from a bowl. Before we continue our journey through the streets and markets of Rome, let us pause for a moment to understand the rhythm of meals in the ancient world. Romans typically ate 3 meals a day, though the size and importance of these meals were very different from what we might expect. The ientaculum, as we have seen, was a light breakfast eaten shortly after waking. It was simple, quick, and required no preparation. The second meal of the day was called the prandium. This was eaten around midday, when the sun was at its highest and the heat of the day made heavy work difficult.
The prandium was also a relatively simple meal, perhaps some bread and cheese, cold meat or fish left over from the previous day, vegetables, fruit, or nuts. Like the breakfast, it was usually eaten quickly and without ceremony. The main meal of the day was the cena, eaten in the late afternoon or early evening as the heat of the day began to fade. For wealthy Romans, the cena could be an elaborate affair, lasting for hours with multiple courses, entertainment, and guests. But for ordinary people, the cena was simpler, though still the most substantial meal of the day. This pattern of eating, light in the morning and at midday, heavier in the evening, made sense in the context of Roman life. The mornings and early afternoons were times for work, and heavy meals would have been impractical. The evening, when the day's labor was done, was the time for rest, relaxation, and the enjoyment of food. Understanding this rhythm helps us appreciate why street food and prepared food were so important in ancient Rome. Most people simply did not have the time, the space, or the equipment to prepare elaborate meals. They needed food that was quick, portable, and ready to eat. And the city of Rome was organized to provide exactly that.
As we walk through the streets of ancient Rome, we begin to notice something remarkable. Food is everywhere. Unlike modern cities, where restaurants and food shops are clustered in certain areas, ancient Rome was saturated with places to buy and eat food. Almost every street, every corner, every neighborhood had its vendors, its cookshops, its taverns. This was not an accident. It was a direct result of how most Romans lived. Without home kitchens, people had no choice but to buy their food ready-made. And Roman entrepreneurs, always quick to spot an opportunity, were happy to provide it. The most common type of establishment was called a thermopolium. The name comes from Greek words meaning a place where hot things are sold. These were small shops, usually open to the street, with a distinctive L-shaped counter built into the front. Set into this counter were large clay jars called dolia, which held hot food, stews, soups, porridges, and other prepared dishes. Imagine approaching one of these thermopolia on a busy afternoon. The counter faces the street, so you can see the dolia arranged in a row, their round openings steaming gently in the warm air. Behind the counter stands the proprietor, perhaps a middle-aged man with a weathered face, or a woman with strong arms and a practical manner. You approach the counter and peer into the dolia. One contains a thick stew of beans and vegetables, flecked with herbs. Another holds a porridge of wheat or barley, soft and warm. A third might contain pieces of meat or fish in a savory sauce. The smells mingle together, earthy, rich, comforting. You tell the proprietor what you want. He or she ladles a portion into a simple clay bowl and hands it to you. You might eat standing at the counter, or carry your bowl to a small table nearby, or simply take it with you as you continue on your way. The prices at these establishments were low, affordable even for workers and laborers who earned only a few coins a day. The food was simple but satisfying, designed to fill the belly and provide energy for the afternoon's work. Thermopolia were found throughout Rome, in every neighborhood, on almost every street. Archaeologists have found the remains of many of these establishments, their counters and dolia still preserved after nearly 2,000 years. In the ruins of Pompeii, the Roman city famously buried by a volcanic eruption, thermopolia have been found with food still inside their jars, frozen in time at the moment of the disaster.
As the morning sun climbs higher above the rooftops of Rome, the city truly awakens. The streets, which were relatively quiet in the pale light of dawn, now begin to fill with people. Let us walk among them, slowly and peacefully, observing the rhythm of daily life as it unfolds around us. The streets of ancient Rome were narrow, much narrower than the broad avenues we might imagine. Many were barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. They wound and twisted between buildings, sometimes opening into small squares or plazas, sometimes narrowing into dim alleyways where the upper floors of buildings nearly touched overhead. The paving stones beneath your feet are worn smooth by centuries of use. In some places they are uneven, tilted by the settling of the ground, or cracked by the weight of countless carts. Raised stepping stones cross the street at intervals, allowing pedestrians to cross without stepping into the mud and refuse that sometimes collected in the gutters. The buildings on either side rise high above you. The lower floors are often occupied by shops, their wooden shutters thrown open to display goods for sale. You pass a cobbler's workshop, where the smell of leather mingles with the sound of hammering. You pass a fuller's shop, where cloth is cleaned and processed, the air sharp with the scent of the chemicals used in the trade. You pass a small shrine set into a wall, where someone has left a small offering of flowers and a few drops of wine. And everywhere, everywhere there is food. A woman sits on a low stool beside a basket of fresh figs, calling out to passers-by in a gentle, rhythmic voice. An old man tends a small brazier on which he roasts chickpeas, their nutty aroma drifting through the air. A boy carries a wooden tray balanced on his head, piled high with round loaves of bread, weaving skillfully through the crowd. The sounds of the street blend together into a gentle, constant murmur. Voices haggling over prices, the clatter of wooden sandals on stone, the creak of a cart being pushed through a narrow passage, the distant bark of a dog, the laughter of children playing in a doorway. This is the daily life of Rome, not grand or dramatic, but ordinary and real. People going about their business, buying what they need, greeting their neighbors, finding small moments of connection in the busy flow of the day. To understand how ordinary Romans ate, we must spend a little more time understanding how they lived. Let us step off the busy street for a moment and enter one of the tall apartment buildings, the insulae, where most of Rome's population made their homes. The entrance to the building is a simple doorway, perhaps flanked by a small shop selling pottery or cloth. You step through and find yourself in a dim corridor. The air is cooler here, sheltered from the sun, but it carries a faint mustiness, the smell of old wood and close-packed humanity. A narrow staircase leads upward. The steps are steep and worn in the center, smoothed by generations of feet. As you climb, you pass doorways opening onto small apartments. Through an open door, you glimpse a single room containing a bed, a wooden chest, and a few clay pots. A woman sits by the window mending a garment. A child plays quietly on the floor. The higher you climb, the smaller and simpler the apartments become. On the upper floors, entire families might live in a single room no larger than a modern closet. The ceilings are low, the windows are small, the walls are thin, and you can hear the sounds of neighbors on every side, conversations, arguments, the crying of babies, the snoring of sleepers.
There are no kitchens in these apartments. There is no running water. There are no toilets. For water, residents must descend to the street and walk to the nearest public fountain, carrying heavy jars back up the narrow stairs. For toilet facilities, they might use a chamber pot that must be emptied each day, or they might visit one of the public latrines found throughout the city. And for food, for hot, cooked food, they must go out. They must buy their meals from the thermopolia, the street vendors, the small taverns that serve the needs of the common people. This is not a hardship, not really. It is simply the way things are. The insulae are not designed for cooking. The risk of fire is too great. And so the streets of Rome have evolved to meet this need, becoming a vast outdoor kitchen where food is prepared, sold, and eaten at every hour of the day. What did ordinary Romans actually eat? Let us explore this question slowly and carefully, building a picture of the simple, satisfying foods that sustained the common people of the ancient city. The foundation of the Roman diet, as we have already seen, was bread. But not all bread was the same. The quality of bread varied enormously, depending on the type of grain used and how finely it was milled. The finest bread was made from wheat flour that had been carefully sifted to remove the coarse bran and germ. This produced a white, soft loaf that was light and pleasant to eat. Such bread was called panis silenius, and it was expensive, a luxury enjoyed mainly by the wealthy. Most ordinary Romans ate darker, coarser bread, made from less refined flour. This bread was heavier and denser, with a stronger, earthier flavor. It was called panis plebeus, the bread of the common people. Though less elegant than white bread, it was nutritious and filling, and it formed the backbone of the ordinary Roman diet. There was also bread made from other grains, barley, millet, or spelt. These were generally considered inferior to wheat bread, but they were cheaper and more readily available, especially in times of shortage. The poorest Romans might eat bread made from whatever grain they could afford, regardless of its quality. Beyond bread, the Roman diet included a wide variety of simple foods. Olives were consumed in enormous quantities, eaten whole, pressed into oil, or preserved in brine. Olive oil was used for cooking, for dressing foods, for lighting lamps, and even for bathing. It was one of the most essential commodities in the Roman world. Cheese was another staple. Roman cheese was typically made from sheep's or goat's milk, though cow's milk cheese also existed. Fresh cheese was soft and mild, while aged cheese was harder and strongly flavored. Cheese could be eaten on its own, crumbled over other foods, or used in cooking. Vegetables were abundant and varied. Romans ate beans, lentils, chickpeas, cabbage, lettuce, onions, garlic, leeks, turnips, radishes, carrots, and many other vegetables that we would recognize today. These were often cooked into stews or soups, seasoned with herbs and spices, and served with bread. Fruits were enjoyed both fresh and dried. Figs, dates, grapes, apples, pears, plums, and pomegranates were all commonly eaten. Dried fruits were especially important because they could be stored for long periods, providing sweetness and nutrition even in winter when fresh fruits were scarce. Nuts, walnuts, almonds, hazelnuts, and pine nuts were also popular. They could be eaten as snacks, added to dishes for texture and flavor, or ground into pastes and sauces. Meat was less common in the diet of ordinary people. It was more expensive than plant foods, and many families could afford it only occasionally. When meat was eaten, it was often pork, the most common meat in Roman Italy. Sausages were popular, as were various cuts of pork that could be salted or smoked for preservation. Chicken, goose, and other poultry were also eaten, as were wild game birds when available. Fish and seafood were important, especially in coastal areas and along the Tiber River. Fresh fish was sold in markets, and dried or salted fish was available throughout the year. Shellfish, oysters, mussels, clams were popular delicacies enjoyed by rich and poor alike.
And then there was garum, one of the most distinctive and important ingredients in Roman cooking. Garum was a fermented fish sauce made by layering fish with salt and allowing the mixture to break down over several weeks in the hot sun. The resulting liquid was strained and used as a seasoning, adding a deep, savory umami flavor to countless dishes. To modern tastes, the idea of fermented fish sauce might seem strange or unpleasant, but garum was absolutely central to Roman cuisine. It was used the way we might use salt or soy sauce, to enhance the flavor of other foods, to add depth and complexity to simple dishes. Garum was produced in large quantities along the coasts of the Mediterranean and shipped throughout the empire. There were different grades of garum, from cheap, everyday varieties to expensive, premium sauces made from particular types of fish. Let us now imagine a typical day of eating for an ordinary Roman, a laborer perhaps, or a shopkeeper, or a mother caring for her children in a small apartment high above the street. The day begins, as we have seen, with the ientaculum, the simple breakfast of bread, olives, cheese, or fruit. This meal is eaten quickly, without ceremony, in the dim light of early morning. There is no table, no chairs, no formal setting. You might eat standing by the window, watching the street below come to life. You might eat sitting on the edge of your bed, still shaking off the last traces of sleep. The morning passes in work or errands. You descend to the street, perhaps carrying a jar to fill at the public fountain. You buy a few supplies from vendors, a handful of vegetables, a small measure of oil, a piece of cheese wrapped in leaves. You greet your neighbors, exchange a few words of gossip, and continue on your way.
Around midday, you pause for the prandium, the midday meal. This might be eaten at a thermopolium, where you can buy a bowl of hot stew or porridge for a few small coins. Or it might be a cold meal eaten at home or at your place of work, bread and cheese perhaps, with some olives or a piece of fruit. The afternoon continues. The heat of the day builds and the streets become quieter as people seek shade and rest. In the hottest hours, many shops close their shutters, and the city falls into a gentle drowsiness. As the afternoon fades into evening, thoughts turn to the cena, the main meal of the day. For ordinary Romans, this meal was simple but satisfying. It might consist of a bowl of pulse, a thick porridge made from wheat, barley, or other grains, cooked with water or milk, and flavored with vegetables, herbs, or bits of meat. Pulse was one of the oldest and most traditional Roman foods, eaten for centuries before bread became common. It was hearty, filling, and inexpensive. Or the cena might include a simple stew, beans or lentils cooked with onions and garlic, flavored with garum and olive oil, served with plenty of bread for dipping. Such stews were the everyday food of the common people, varying with the seasons and with whatever ingredients were available and affordable. Perhaps there would be a bit of cheese, a handful of olives, a few fresh vegetables dressed with oil and vinegar. Perhaps, on a special day, a small piece of meat or fish, grilled or stewed, seasoned with herbs and spices. The cena was eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, often before sunset. For most ordinary Romans, there was no elaborate dining room, no reclining couches, no servants bringing course after course. The meal was taken simply. Sitting on a stool or standing by a small table, the family gathered together in their single room. Yet, even in this simplicity, there was pleasure. The taste of warm bread fresh from the baker's oven, the rich, earthy flavor of a well-made stew, the sharp bite of good cheese, the sweetness of a ripe fig. These simple foods brought comfort and satisfaction at the end of a long day. As we continue our journey through the daily life of ancient Rome, let us take a moment to consider how ordinary people dressed. Clothing, like food, tells us much about the rhythms and realities of everyday existence. The basic garment for most Romans was the tunic, a simple rectangular piece of cloth with holes for the head and arms, belted at the waist. Tunics were worn by men, women, and children of all social classes, though the quality of the fabric and the details of the design varied widely. The tunics of ordinary workers were made of coarse wool or linen, often undyed or dyed in simple muted colors, brown, gray, or off-white. They were practical garments, designed for ease of movement and durability rather than elegance. A worker might only own 1 or 2 tunics, wearing them until they were worn thin and patched beyond repair. Over the tunic, citizens might wear a toga, the distinctive draped garment that symbolized Roman citizenship. But togas were cumbersome, expensive, and impractical for daily work. Most ordinary Romans wore them only on special occasions, if they owned them at all. Women often wore a longer tunic called a stola, sometimes layered over an inner tunic. Over this, they might drape a palla, a large rectangular shawl that could be wrapped around the body or pulled over the head. Like men's clothing, women's garments varied in quality depending on wealth and social status. Footwear was simple, leather sandals for most people, with various styles and qualities available depending on one's means. In cooler weather, people might wear closed shoes or boots. The poorest went barefoot. Hair was typically worn simply. Men often kept their hair short, though styles varied over time and between social groups. Women might wear their hair long, braided, or pinned up in various styles, depending on fashion and personal preference. The overall impression of ordinary Romans going about their daily business would be one of simplicity and practicality. Clothing was functional, designed to meet the demands of work and daily life. Bright colors, elaborate jewelry, and expensive fabrics were the province of the wealthy. Most people dressed in muted tones, their garments well-worn and comfortable. One of the most remarkable features of ancient Rome was its water system. The city was supplied by a network of aqueducts, massive engineering projects that brought fresh water from distant springs and rivers into the heart of the city. This water was distributed through a system of pipes and channels to public fountains, baths, and in some cases, private homes. For ordinary Romans living in the insulae, water access meant visiting the public fountains that stood at intervals throughout the city. These fountains were simple structures, often just a basin or trough where water flowed continuously from a spout. Imagine walking to the fountain in the early morning, carrying a large clay jar on your shoulder. The streets are still relatively quiet, the air cool and fresh. You join a small group of neighbors gathered around the fountain, waiting for your turn to fill your jar. The water flows clear and cold, a gentle sound that adds to the peaceful atmosphere of the morning. You hold your jar beneath the spout, feeling the cool spray on your hands, watching the water rise slowly toward the rim. When the jar is full, you lift it carefully onto your shoulder and begin the climb back up to your apartment. This ritual was repeated daily, sometimes multiple times a day, by millions of Romans throughout the city. Water was essential for drinking, cooking, washing, and countless other daily tasks. The public fountains were gathering places, spots where neighbors met and exchanged news, where children played and dogs drank, where the rhythm of daily life flowed as steadily as the water itself. Let us pause for a moment and simply experience the sensory world of an ancient Roman street. Close your eyes, or let them grow soft and unfocused, and imagine yourself standing at the corner of a busy intersection, somewhere in the heart of Rome.
The sounds reach you first, the murmur of voices blending together into a gentle, constant hum, the clatter of wooden wheels on stone as a cart passes by, the rhythmic tap of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby workshop, the cry of a vendor selling hot chickpeas, his voice rising and falling in a musical pattern, the laughter of children playing a game with small stones, the barking of a dog somewhere in the distance,
the splash of water from a fountain, the soft cooing of pigeons on a rooftop above. Now the smells begin to register. The warm, yeasty aroma of bread from a bakery a few doors down, the sharp, tangy scent of garum from a food stall, the earthy smell of vegetables piled in baskets, cabbages, onions, bunches of fresh herbs, the dusty smell of the street itself, the stone and dirt heated by the sun, the faint, acrid whiff of smoke from cooking fires and braziers, the occasional unpleasant odor of refuse or animal dung, quickly passing as the breeze shifts. The light filters down between the tall buildings, creating patterns of sun and shadow on the paving stones. Where the sun reaches, the stone is warm to the touch. In the shadows, it remains cool, a pleasant relief from the midday heat. People move around you, a constant flow of humanity going about the business of daily life. A woman carrying a basket of laundry, a boy leading a donkey loaded with firewood, a group of men deep in conversation, gesturing animatedly, an old woman sitting in a doorway, watching the world go by with calm, patient eyes. This is the texture of daily life in ancient Rome, rich, complex, endlessly varied, yet somehow gentle and familiar. These streets have seen countless generations come and go. These stones have been worn smooth by millions of footsteps. The rhythms of life here are ancient and deep, connecting the present moment to all the moments that have come before. Let us return now to the subject of bread, for it deserves more of our attention. Bread was so central to Roman life that it shaped not only the diet, but also the economy, the politics, and the very structure of the city itself. The Roman government understood the importance of bread. A hungry population was a dangerous population, prone to riots and unrest. And so, beginning in the late Republic and continuing throughout the empire, the state provided free or subsidized grain to the citizens of Rome. This program was called the annona. Grain was imported from Egypt, North Africa, and other parts of the empire, shipped across the Mediterranean in enormous cargo vessels, and stored in vast warehouses along the Tiber River. Citizens who qualified for the program could receive a monthly allotment of grain, which they could then take to a baker to be ground and baked into bread. The bakeries that served this purpose were substantial operations. They contained large millstones for grinding grain into flour, mixing areas where dough was prepared, and massive wood-fired ovens where the bread was baked. Some bakeries employed dozens of workers, including the slaves who turned the millstones and the skilled bakers who shaped and baked the loaves. The ovens themselves were impressive structures, large domed chambers made of brick or stone, heated by fires built on the oven floor. When the oven reached the proper temperature, the coals were raked out and the loaves were placed inside to bake in the residual heat. The process required skill and experience, as the baker had to judge the temperature of the oven and the timing of the bake with precision. The bread that emerged from these ovens was round and substantial, often weighing a kilogram or more. It was typically scored with deep lines that divided the loaf into wedges, making it easy to break and share. The crust was thick and chewy, the interior dense but soft. Eaten fresh, still warm from the oven, it was one of the simple pleasures of Roman life. Not all bread was plain. Bakers also produced a variety of specialty breads for those who could afford them. There were breads flavored with cheese, with anise, with poppy seeds. There were sweetbreads enriched with honey and dried fruits. There were breads shaped into elaborate forms, animals, flowers, geometric patterns for special occasions and festivals. But for most people, most of the time, bread was simply bread, the daily staple that filled the belly and sustained the body through the demands of work and life. While bread was the foundation of the Roman diet, vegetables provided essential variety and nutrition. The Romans cultivated a wide range of vegetables, many of which would be familiar to us today, along with some that have fallen out of common use. Legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, peas were among the most important vegetables in the Roman diet. They were nutritious, filling, and relatively inexpensive. They could be dried and stored for long periods, providing sustenance through the winter months when fresh vegetables were scarce. Cooked into soups, stews, and porridges, legumes were the everyday food of ordinary people. Onions and garlic were used abundantly in Roman cooking, providing flavor and pungency to otherwise simple dishes. Leeks, a milder member of the onion family, were also popular. These vegetables formed the aromatic base of many Roman recipes. Cabbage was highly valued, considered not only nutritious but also medicinal. The Romans believed that cabbage could cure a variety of ailments, from digestive problems to headaches. It was eaten raw, cooked, or pickled, and it featured prominently in the diet of both rich and poor. Lettuce, radishes, and cucumbers provided freshness and crunch, especially in the warmer months. These vegetables were often eaten raw, dressed with olive oil, vinegar, and garum. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips, beets were staples of the Roman garden. They could be stored through the winter, providing reliable nutrition when other vegetables were unavailable. Herbs were used generously in Roman cooking. Parsley, coriander, dill, mint, oregano, thyme, and many others added flavor and fragrance to dishes. Fresh herbs were available in season, while dried herbs could be used year-round.
The vegetables sold in Roman markets came from gardens on the outskirts of the city, from farms in the surrounding countryside, and from more distant regions of the empire. Market gardeners rose before dawn to harvest their crops, loading them onto carts or donkeys for the journey into the city. By the time the markets opened, fresh vegetables were piled high in stalls and baskets, ready for the day's customers. No discussion of Roman food would be complete without mention of the olive, one of the most important and versatile crops in the Mediterranean world. Olive trees grew throughout Italy and the broader Roman Empire, their gnarled trunks and silvery leaves a familiar sight in the landscape. The fruit of the olive tree could be eaten directly, preserved in brine or salt, or pressed to extract its precious oil. Olive oil was used for almost everything. It was used for cooking, frying, sautéing, dressing salads and vegetables. It was used for preserving foods, sealing jars, coating cheeses, packing fish. It was used for lighting, burned in small clay lamps that provided illumination after dark. It was used for bathing, rubbed on the skin and then scraped off with a curved tool called a strigil. It was used for medicine, applied to wounds, mixed into remedies, believed to promote health and vitality. The quality of olive oil varied widely. The finest oil, called oleum ex albis olevis, was made from green, unripe olives harvested early in the season. This oil was light, delicate, and expensive, a luxury enjoyed by the wealthy. Ordinary people used cheaper oils made from riper olives or from the later pressings, which were darker, stronger, and more affordable. Olives themselves were eaten in many forms.
Fresh olives were too bitter to eat directly from the tree. They had to be cured in brine, salt, or lye to remove their bitterness. Once cured, they could be eaten as snacks, added to dishes, or chopped and mixed with other ingredients. The olive was so important to Roman culture that it carried symbolic meaning as well. Olive wreaths crowned victorious athletes and honored distinguished citizens. Olive branches symbolized peace and goodwill. The olive tree itself was considered sacred, a gift from the gods. What did ordinary Romans drink? The answer, for most people, most of the time, was wine, though not in the way we might imagine. Roman wine was quite different from modern wine. It was typically stronger, sweeter, and more intensely flavored. And crucially, it was almost never drunk straight. Instead, Romans mixed their wine with water, creating a diluted beverage that could be consumed throughout the day without causing intoxication. The proportion of water to wine varied depending on the occasion and the preference of the drinker. A common ratio was 3 parts water to 1 part wine, though some people preferred their wine more diluted, while others liked it stronger. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, something foreigners did, not civilized Romans. The practice of mixing wine with water was so ingrained in Roman culture that the word for a drinking party, symposium, literally meant drinking together, with the shared mixing of wine and water as a central ritual. Wine was also often flavored with honey, spices, or herbs, creating a variety of sweetened and spiced beverages. Mulsum, a mixture of wine and honey, was particularly popular, especially as an aperiste served before meals. For those who could not afford wine or who simply wanted something lighter, there was posca, a beverage made from mixing water with soured wine or vinegar. Posca was cheap, refreshing, and mildly antiseptic, making it a practical drink for laborers and soldiers. Though it might sound unpleasant to modern tastes, posca was widely consumed throughout the Roman world. Fresh water was also drunk, of course, especially from the clean, cold water that flowed through Rome's aqueducts and fountains. But wine, in its various diluted forms, was the standard beverage of daily life. As the morning sun rises higher over the city of Rome, the markets come fully alive. Let us walk together through one of these bustling gathering places, moving slowly, observing everything with calm and curious eyes. The main markets of Rome were called macella, enclosed market buildings where vendors sold meat, fish, and other foods. But beyond these formal markets, commerce spilled out into every street and plaza. Vendors set up temporary stalls wherever they could find space. Farmers spread their produce on cloths laid directly on the ground. Merchants called out the virtues of their wares, their voices blending into a gentle, rhythmic chorus. Imagine entering one of the larger market squares. The space is surrounded by colonnades, covered walkways supported by stone columns that provide shade from the sun and shelter from occasional rain. Within the colonnades, permanent shops display their goods. In the open center of the square, temporary vendors have set up their stalls. The variety of goods is remarkable. Here is a stall piled high with fresh vegetables, deep green cabbages, purple-tinged onions, bunches of fragrant herbs tied with twine. There is a vendor selling eggs, carefully arranged in baskets lined with straw. Beside him, a woman offers small clay pots of honey, golden and translucent in the morning light. Further along, you find the fish sellers. Their stalls are wet and glistening, the catch of the day arranged on beds of seaweed or rushes. There are silvery sardines and anchovies, larger fish with scales that shimmer like coins, octopus with curling tentacles, baskets of oysters and mussels still closed tight. The smell of the sea hangs in the air, fresh and briny. The meat sellers occupy another section of the market. Cuts of pork hang from hooks, haunches and shoulders, strings of sausages, pale slabs of bacon waiting to be cured. There are chickens and geese, some still alive and clucking in wooden cages, others already plucked and cleaned. A butcher works at a wooden block, his cleaver rising and falling with practiced rhythm.
And everywhere there is bread. Bakers have sent their apprentices to the market with baskets and trays, selling loaves to shoppers who want fresh bread to take home with their other purchases. The bread is still warm in some cases, the crust crackling softly when pressed. The sounds of the market wash over you like gentle waves, voices haggling over prices, exchanging greetings, sharing news and gossip, the clink of coins changing hands, the thump of produce being set down on wooden counters, the squawk of poultry, the splash of water as a fishmonger rinses his stall, children running and laughing between the stalls. This is not a place of urgency or stress. The pace is measured, unhurried. People take their time, examining goods carefully, chatting with vendors they have known for years. The market is not just a place to buy and sell. It is a social gathering place, a center of community life, a space where the rhythms of the city become visible and tangible. Let us pause and observe a transaction, a simple act of commerce that was repeated countless times each day throughout the markets of Rome. A woman approaches a vegetable stall. She is perhaps 30 years old, wearing a simple tunic and a palla draped over her shoulders. She carries a woven basket over her arm, already containing a few items, a small jar of oil, a piece of cheese wrapped in leaves. The vendor greets her with a nod and a few words. They know each other, these two. The woman is a regular customer, and the vendor remembers her preferences. He gestures toward his display of vegetables, pointing out what is fresh today, what is particularly good. The woman examines the offerings carefully. She picks up an onion, weighing it in her hand, pressing gently to test its firmness. She selects a few that meet her standards and sets them aside. She chooses a cabbage, a bunch of leeks, a handful of dried beans from a basket. Now comes the negotiation. The vendor names a price. The woman counters with a lower offer. They go back and forth, neither angry nor impatient, following a ritual as old as commerce itself. Eventually, they reach an agreement. The woman counts out a few small bronze coins from a pouch at her belt and hands them to the vendor. He places her purchases in her basket, perhaps adding a sprig of parsley as a gift, a gesture of goodwill between regular customer and trusted seller. The woman thanks him and moves on to the next stall. The vendor turns to greet his next customer. The transaction is complete. A small but essential exchange that keeps the wheels of daily life turning. Roman currency consisted of coins in various denominations. The basic unit was the as, a bronze coin of modest value. Larger transactions might use the sestertius, worth 4 asses, or the denarius, a silver coin worth 16 asses. For very large purchases, there were gold coins called aurei, though these were rarely seen in ordinary transactions of daily life. Most purchases in the market were made with small bronze coins, a few asses for a loaf of bread, a handful for vegetables, perhaps a sestertius for a piece of meat or fish. The coins were worn smooth by use, their images of emperors and gods rubbed faint by countless hands. In a world without refrigeration, the preservation of food was a constant concern. Romans developed many techniques for keeping food edible over time, allowing them to store provisions for lean seasons and to transport goods across the vast distances of the empire. Salting was one of the oldest and most important preservation methods. Salt draws moisture out of food, inhibiting the growth of bacteria and mold.
Meat and fish were heavily salted and then dried or packed in salt, creating products that could last for months or even years. Salted pork, including bacon and ham, was a staple of the Roman diet, providing protein and flavor throughout the year. Smoking was another common technique, especially for fish and meat. Foods were hung over slow-burning fires, the smoke penetrating the flesh and creating a protective coating that resisted spoilage. Smoked fish and sausages were popular throughout the Roman world. Drying was used for fruits, vegetables, and grains. Figs, dates, and grapes were dried in the sun, becoming concentrated in sweetness and easy to store. Beans and lentils were dried and kept in sealed jars or baskets, ready to be cooked when needed. Pickling, preserving foods in vinegar or brine, was another option. Vegetables could be pickled in vinegar, while olives and certain fish were preserved in brine. These pickled foods added variety and pungency to the diet, and they could be kept for extended periods. Honey was used as a preservative, particularly for fruits. Its high sugar content and natural antimicrobial properties made it effective at preventing spoilage. Fruits preserved in honey were a delicacy, sweet and flavorful. Oil was also used for preservation. Cheese could be coated in oil to seal out air and moisture. Fish packed in oil, similar to modern canned sardines, could be stored for considerable lengths of time. These preservation techniques were not merely practical, they also shaped the flavors and textures of Roman cuisine. Salted, smoked, dried, and pickled foods had distinctive tastes that became central to the Roman palate. The pungent flavor of garum, the sharp bite of pickled vegetables, the concentrated sweetness of dried figs, these were the tastes of preservation, the flavors of a world that had learned to make food last. Most of the food consumed in Rome came from the countryside, from farms and estates scattered across Italy and the broader empire. The labor of growing this food was performed largely by slaves and tenant farmers, whose lives were quite different from those of city dwellers.
Agriculture in Roman Italy centered on three crops: grain, grapes, and olives. These formed the agricultural triad that sustained the Mediterranean world. Grain, primarily wheat and barley, was grown on large estates and small farms alike. The work was seasonal and demanding. In autumn, fields were plowed using wooden plows pulled by oxen. Seeds were sown by hand, scattered across the furrows. In spring and early summer, the growing crops required weeding and protection from pests and disease. In late summer, the harvest began, workers cutting the grain with curved sickles, binding the stalks into sheaths, carrying them to threshing floors where the grain was separated from the straw. Grape cultivation was equally labor-intensive. Vineyards required constant attention, pruning in winter, training the vines in spring, harvesting in autumn. The harvest was a festive time, with workers gathering the ripe grapes and carrying them to pressing facilities where the juice was extracted. The juice was then fermented in large clay vessels called dolia, eventually becoming the wine that Romans drank. Olive cultivation was perhaps slightly less demanding, as olive trees were hardy and long-lived, but the harvest, collecting the ripe olives from the trees, was still significant work. The olives were then pressed to extract their oil, a process that required heavy stone presses and considerable labor. Beyond these staples, farmers grew vegetables, raised livestock, kept bees for honey, and cultivated fruit trees. Chickens scratched in farmyards, goats and sheep grazed on hillsides, pigs rooted in forests, fattening on acorns and beech nuts. The food produced in the countryside traveled to Rome along roads, rivers, and sea routes. Carts carried grain and vegetables from nearby farms.
Barges floated down the Tiber loaded with wine and oil. Ships crossed the Mediterranean bringing grain from Egypt and Africa, garum from Spain, spices from the East. This vast network of production and distribution kept Rome fed, a remarkable achievement of organization and logistics that sustained one of the largest cities the ancient world had ever known. Any honest account of Roman daily life must acknowledge the central role of slavery. Roman society depended on the labor of enslaved people, who performed much of the work that kept the economy functioning. Slaves worked in homes, in fields, in mines, in workshops. They cooked meals, raised children, tended gardens. They were bought and sold like property, subject to the complete authority of their owners. Their lives varied enormously, from the relative comfort of household slaves in wealthy families to the brutal conditions of slaves in mines and on large agricultural estates. In the food industry, slaves played crucial roles. They ground grain in bakeries, tended fryers in kitchens, served meals in wealthy homes. On farms, enslaved workers performed much of the back-breaking labor of planting and harvesting. In the great warehouses of Rome, slaves loaded and unloaded the endless stream of goods. Some slaves eventually gained their freedom, becoming liberti, freed people. Manumission, the formal freeing of a slave, could occur for various reasons. Some slaves saved money and purchased their freedom. Others were freed in the wills of grateful owners. Still others earned freedom through exceptional service. Freed people occupied an intermediate position in Roman society. They were no longer property, but they retained obligations to their former owners and faced certain legal restrictions. Many freed people became successful business owners, including operators of bakeries, taverns, and food stalls. Some became quite wealthy, though they could never fully escape the stigma of their enslaved origins. The food that ordinary Romans ate was, in many cases, produced and prepared by enslaved hands. The bread came from bakeries where slaves turned the millstones. The wine came from vineyards worked by slave labor. The garum came from factories where slaves processed the fish. This uncomfortable reality was woven into the fabric of Roman daily life, often invisible to those who benefited from it, but ever present nonetheless. Roman eating followed the rhythms of the agricultural year. Different foods were available in different seasons, and the diet shifted accordingly. Spring brought fresh greens after the scarcity of winter. Lettuces, young onions, asparagus, and tender herbs appeared in the markets. Eggs were plentiful as birds began laying in earnest. The first fresh cheeses of the season were made from the milk of animals that had given birth during the winter. Summer was the season of abundance. Vegetables of all kinds filled the market stalls. Fruits ripened in succession: cherries, apricots, plums, peaches, melons. Fish were plentiful in the warm waters. It was a time of eating fresh, enjoying the bounty while it lasted. Autumn brought the harvests. Grapes were picked and pressed into wine. Olives were gathered for oil and preservation. Grain was threshed and stored. Figs and dates were dried for winter. It was a time of hard work and celebration as the year's produce was gathered and secured. Winter was the lean season. Fresh vegetables were scarce, and diets relied more heavily on preserved foods: salted meat and fish, dried beans and lentils, pickled vegetables, stored grain. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips could be stored through the cold months. Dried fruits provided sweetness when fresh fruits were unavailable. This seasonal rhythm was fundamental to Roman life. People ate what was available when it was available. There was no expectation of having fresh strawberries in winter or pumpkins in spring. The diet was varied and interesting precisely because it changed with the seasons, offering different pleasures at different times of year.
As the afternoon slowly passes, the fierce heat of the Roman sun begins to soften. The light, which was harsh and white at midday, now turns golden and warm. Shadows lengthen across the cobblestones, stretching from building to building, creating pools of cool shade where people linger and rest. The pace of the city changes. The frantic energy of the morning markets has faded. The shops that closed during the hottest hours begin to reopen, their shutters thrown back to catch the gentler light. Vendors who retreated indoors now return to their stalls, arranging their remaining goods, hoping for a few more sales before the day ends. In the residential neighborhoods, life stirs again. Children who napped through the heat emerge to play in the streets, their voices echoing between the tall buildings. Women begin preparing for the evening meal, checking their supplies, perhaps making one last trip to a nearby vendor for fresh bread or a bit of cheese. Men return from their work, laborers with tired muscles and dusty clothes, shopkeepers counting the day's earnings, craftsmen putting away their tools. They greet their neighbors, pause for brief conversations, slowly making their way home through the familiar streets. The air carries the first hints of evening cooking. From Thermopolia and Tabernae, the smell of warming stews drifts into the streets. Somewhere, bread is being pulled from an oven, its crust crackling in the cooling air. The scent of garlic and onions frying in olive oil mingles with the earthy aroma of beans simmering in clay pots. This is the transitional hour, the gentle pause between the activity of day and the quieter rhythms of evening. The city seems to take a collective breath, releasing the tensions of work and commerce, preparing for the softer pleasures of food, family, and rest. As the sun sinks lower, touching the rooftops with amber and rose, thoughts turn fully to the cena, the main meal of the Roman day. This is the meal that matters most, the time when families gather, when the day's hunger is finally satisfied, when the simple pleasures of food and companionship come together. For ordinary Romans, the cena was not elaborate. There were no servants bearing silver platters, no reclining on cushioned couches, no parade of exotic dishes from distant lands. These were the privileges of the wealthy, glimpsed perhaps at festivals or public distributions, but not part of everyday experience. Instead, the ordinary cena was simple and satisfying. Let us imagine such a meal in a small apartment high over the street. The room is modest, perhaps 4 paces by 5, with walls of plastered brick and a single small window looking out over the rooftops. A wooden table, scarred by years of use, occupies the center of the space. Around it are a few stools, their legs worn smooth. The mother of the family has prepared the meal with the limited resources available. There is no kitchen in this apartment, no proper cooking fire, but she has a small portable brazier, a clay container holding a few glowing coals, and with this she has managed to warm a pot of stew. The stew is the heart of the meal. It is made from dried beans that were soaked the night before and simmered slowly through the afternoon. Onions and garlic provide flavor. A splash of garum adds depth and saltiness. A generous pour of olive oil makes the stew rich and satisfying. Perhaps there are a few vegetables, some cabbage, a handful of leeks, added to stretch the meal further. Beside the stew sits a round loaf of bread, purchased fresh from the baker earlier in the day. The crust is thick and golden, the interior dense but soft. The bread will be broken into pieces, used to scoop up the stew, to soak up every drop of the flavorful liquid. There is a small dish of olives,
brined and glistening, a piece of cheese, firm and slightly sharp, a few dried figs for sweetness at the end of the meal, a jug of wine already mixed with water, ready to be poured into simple clay cups. The family gathers around the table. The father, still bearing the tiredness of a day's labor, takes his place at the head. The mother serves the food, ladling stew into bowls, distributing bread. The children, perhaps 2 or 3 of them, watch with eager eyes, their bellies rumbling with anticipation. They eat slowly, savoring each bite. The father speaks of his work, the small events of the day. The mother shares news from the market, gossip from the neighborhood fountain. The children chatter about their games and adventures. The conversation flows easily, punctuated by the sounds of eating, the soft tearing of bread, the clink of spoons against clay bowls, the quiet satisfaction of hunger being satisfied. This is the cena of ordinary Romans, not a feast, but something perhaps more precious, a moment of togetherness at the end of a long day, a simple meal shared with those you love, the taste of familiar foods, prepared with care, eaten in the comfort of home. While we focus on the lives of ordinary people, it is worth pausing to consider how the wealthy dined, if only to appreciate the contrast. The elaborate dinner parties of the Roman elite were legendary, described in detail by ancient writers and immortalized in literature. Wealthy Romans ate their cena in a special room called a triclinium, named for the 3 couches arranged around a central table. Diners reclined on these couches, propped on their left elbows, eating with their right hands. Slaves served the food, bringing course after course from the kitchen.
A formal dinner might include 3 main courses. The gustatio, the appetizer course, featured light dishes designed to stimulate the appetite. Eggs, vegetables, shellfish, and small portions of meat or fish might be served, accompanied by mulsum, the sweet honey wine. The prima mensa, the main course, was the heart of the meal. This might include roasted meats, elaborate fish dishes, game birds, and complex preparations that showcase the skill of the cook. Sauces made from garum, wine, honey, and exotic spices accompanied the dishes. The secunda mensa, the dessert course, brought fruits, nuts, cakes, and sweet pastries. This was a time for lighter fare and leisurely conversation. These dinners could last for hours, stretching from late afternoon into the night. Entertainment was provided: musicians, dancers, poets reciting verses, acrobats performing feats. Conversation ranged from gossip to philosophy to politics. The foods served at these dinners were often exotic and expensive. Peacock, flamingo, dormice fattened on nuts, sea urchins, rare mushrooms, fruits shipped from distant provinces. The display of such foods was itself a statement of wealth and status. But these elaborate banquets were far removed from the experience of ordinary Romans. Most people would never recline on a dining couch, never taste peacock or dormouse, never attend a dinner party lasting half the night. Their cena was simpler, and in its simplicity, perhaps more honest and more deeply satisfying. The sun has set now, slipping below the western hills and leaving the sky awash in shades of purple and deep blue. The first stars appear, faint points of light in the darkening heavens. The city of Rome, which was so bright and busy just hours ago, begins to transform. Night in ancient Rome was different from night in a modern city. There was no electric lighting, no street lamps glowing at regular intervals, no illuminated signs or windows. When the sun set, darkness came, true darkness, deep and enveloping. The streets, so crowded during the day, grew quiet. Most people retreated indoors as darkness fell. The narrow alleyways and winding lanes became shadowy and uncertain, their familiar daytime landmarks hidden in the gloom. Some light existed, of course. Oil lamps burned in windows, casting small pools of warm, flickering glow. Torches illuminated the entrances of wealthy homes. Lanterns bobbed in the hands of those few who ventured out after dark, their flames guttering in the evening breeze. But beyond these small circles of light, the darkness was profound. The Romans were well aware of the dangers that lurked in the nighttime streets: thieves and cut-purses, drunken revelers looking for trouble, collapsing buildings and open sewers that were hazardous enough by day and treacherous by night. For most ordinary people, night was a time to stay home, to rest, to prepare for the next day's labor. The cena had been eaten, the day's work was done, and there was nothing to do but sleep. And now, dear listener, our journey through ancient Rome draws gently toward its close. We have walked together through narrow streets and busy markets. We have smelled the bread baking in clay ovens, tasted the stew simmering in thermopolia pots, felt the warmth of oil lamps flickering in small apartments. We have witnessed the daily rhythms of ordinary life, the early morning breakfast of bread and olives, the midday pause for a simple meal, the evening gathering of family around the cena table. We have seen how food connected people to each other, to their communities, to the gods, and to the land that sustained them. The Rome we have explored is not the Rome of emperors and gladiators, of conquering legions and marble monuments. It is a quieter Rome, a humbler Rome, the Rome of bakers and vendors, of mothers and children, of workers returning tired but satisfied from a day's labor. This Rome existed in the spaces between the great events of history. While emperors rose and fell, while wars were fought and won, while philosophers debated and poets composed, ordinary people went on living their ordinary lives. They bought their bread, cooked their stews, shared their meals, and slept through the long, quiet nights. Their names are lost to us now. The baker who rose before dawn to light his ovens, the woman who carried water from the fountain, the children who played in dusty courtyards. We do not know what they were called or what became of them. They left no monuments, wrote no books, commanded no armies. And yet they were the true Rome. They were the millions who built the empire with their labor, who sustained it with their work, who made it possible for the famous names of history to do whatever it was they did. Without the bakers and farmers, the vendors and laborers, there would have been no Rome at all. The night has grown deep now, both in ancient Rome and here, wherever you are listening. The sounds of the city have faded to a gentle murmur. The last lamps have been extinguished. The darkness is soft and complete. In the small apartments of the insulae, families sleep peacefully, their bellies full of simple food, their bodies tired from honest work, their minds drifting through dreams of the day that has passed and the day that will come. The streets are quiet. Only the occasional cart rumbles past, its wheels creaking on the stones. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, then falls silent. The Tiber flows on as it has for thousands of years, carrying the reflections of stars on its dark waters. This is the Rome that we leave behind now, a Rome of ordinary people living ordinary lives, finding sustenance and comfort in the simple foods that grew from the earth and arrived in the markets through the labor of countless hands. Let this ancient world fade gently from your mind now.
Let the images of narrow streets and clay ovens, of bread and olives and warm stew, drift softly into the background of your thoughts. Feel yourself becoming heavy and relaxed. Feel the quiet of the night settling around you. Let your breathing become slow and deep, like the breathing of those ancient sleepers in their small apartments, resting after a day of life. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the past. I hope you have found it peaceful, restful, and perhaps a little interesting. The story of food in ancient Rome is, in the end, a story about all of us, about the universal human need to eat, to share, to find comfort in simple pleasures. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I wish you rest and peace. May your sleep be deep and restorative. May your dreams be gentle. And may you wake refreshed, ready for whatever the new day brings. The ancient Romans are gone now, their streets buried beneath modern cities, their voices silenced by the passage of 2,000 years. But their humanity remains, echoed in our own need for food, for family, for rest at the end of a long day. Sleep well, dear listener. The world will be here when you wake. For now, let go of everything. Let the darkness embrace you. Let the quiet carry you gently into sleep. Good night.